December 16th, 1944. 0530 hours. The Ardennes Forest lay submerged beneath a low winter fog, the kind that muffled sound and distorted distance, turning trees into silhouettes and men into shadows. Along a frozen ridgeline near Losheim, riflemen of the Battle of the Bulge prepared for what they believed would be another quiet morning. For 3 days, American artillery had been almost silent. No ranging shots, no harassment fire, no nightly barrages. For German soldiers conditioned by months of relentless Allied pressure, the silence felt unnatural, but not yet threatening. In a shallow trench scraped from frozen earth, a 19-year-old machine gunner from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend climbed up to inspect his MG-42. Like many around him, he interpreted the stillness as exhaustion on the American side. Perhaps the enemy had outrun his supplies. Perhaps the winter weather had grounded observation aircraft. Perhaps, so many hoped, the Americans were finally pausing. This belief was not naive. It was rooted in 5 years of continuous war. German soldiers in 1944 considered themselves the most experienced fighters on earth. They had marched through Poland in 1939, smashed France in 1940, endured the cauldrons of Russia, fought the British in North Africa, and traded artillery blows with the Red Army on a scale no Western force had ever matched. They had learned to read artillery fire like weather. They knew the rhythm. A ranging shot, a pause, a correction, then the main barrage. They knew when to dive, when to wait, when to move. Artillery, in their understanding, was powerful, but predictable. This assumption was universal across the Wehrmacht. Artillery was still regarded as a brutal but methodical arm, constrained by time, calculation, and ammunition. Even the Soviet Union's massed fires, terrifying as they were, followed patterns. The British favored carefully planned, creeping barrages. German doctrine itself emphasized deliberate fire, rationed shells, and centralized approval. Nowhere in German experience existed a precedent for what was about to occur. At 0531, the first sound cut through the fog, not an explosion, but a whistle. It was brief, almost delicate, then another, and another. Within seconds, the sky seemed to inhale, then it tore itself apart. In the first 4 minutes, American batteries fired 4,152 shells into the German forward positions. That translated to 1,188 shells per minute. Nearly 20 shells every second. The ground convulsed as if struck by a seismic event. Trees snapped, trenches collapsed. Men were buried alive without ever seeing their enemy. There was no ranging fire, no warning sequence, no gradual escalation. The first shell and the last shell arrived together. German survivors would later struggle to describe the sensation. It was not merely noise or destruction. It was disorientation at a level they had never experienced. The very idea of taking cover became meaningless when the entire grid square was annihilated simultaneously. For those caught in the open, there was no survival interval, no margin, no time to think. This was American artillery, not as a weapon, but as a system. World War II is often remembered as a conflict of tanks, aircraft, and infantry maneuvers. But beneath those visible elements lay a quieter revolution, one that redefined how battles were decided. Artillery had always been called the god of war, a phrase dating back to Napoleon. The Americans did not dispute this title. They simply transformed the god into an industrial machine, faster, more precise, and overwhelmingly destructive beyond anything the German army believed possible. The men enduring that first morning barrage in the Ardennes were not green troops. They were veterans hardened by years of combat. They had survived Soviet Katyusha rockets, British 25-pounders, and French guns left over from 1918. They believed they understood artillery. What they encountered instead was something fundamentally different in character. German military culture had been shaped by scarcity. Ammunition was always finite. Fuel was always limited. Fire missions required approval, coordination, and justification. Every shell fired had to count, because there might not be another tomorrow. Even at the height of German power in 1941, logistical constraints dictated caution. By 1944, those constraints had become crippling. The American Army operated under a different premise entirely. From the beginning of its involvement in the war, the United States treated artillery not as an auxiliary arm, but as the primary instrument of battlefield control. Infantry maneuvered because artillery made movement possible. Tanks advanced because artillery suppressed resistance ahead of them. Aircraft supported when available, but artillery was constant, day and night, in any weather. This philosophy shocked German officers when they first encountered it in North Africa in late 1942. There, near El Alamein, veterans of the Afrika Korps noticed something unsettling. American barrages were not merely heavier than British ones. They were faster. Targets disappeared before countermeasures could be organized. Command posts were struck before orders could be issued. Communication lines vanished within minutes of detection. What disturbed German observers most was not the number of guns, but the speed of response. American artillery reacted to targets in minutes, sometimes seconds. German batteries often required 15 to 20 minutes to calculate firing data, verify coordinates, and transmit orders. The Americans compressed that cycle until it was almost instantaneous. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, this system had matured into something approaching mechanical perfection. German planners had chosen December precisely because they believed weather would neutralize Allied air power. Fog, snow, and low ceilings would ground American aircraft. Without air support, they reasoned, American forces would revert to slower, more deliberate methods. Artillery, they assumed, would be constrained by observation limits and ammunition stocks. They were wrong on every count. American artillery did not rely on aircraft for targeting. Forward observers embedded with infantry units carried radios that linked them directly to centralized fire direction centers. These centers did not control a single battery. They controlled entire divisions' worth of guns. Calculations were pre-computed. Maps were standardized. Firing tables were prepared in advance for every conceivable range and condition. Most importantly, American doctrine allowed any observer to call on any available gun. There was no hierarchical bottleneck, no competition between units, no need to conserve shells for later phases. If a target appeared, it was destroyed. The German army had never faced such freedom of fire. This disparity was not merely tactical, it was philosophical. German doctrine viewed war as a contest of skill, discipline, and endurance. American doctrine increasingly treated war as a problem of throughput, how quickly force could be applied, multiplied, and sustained. Artillery was the ideal expression of this mindset. It converted industrial output directly into battlefield dominance. By 1944, American factories were producing artillery ammunition at a scale that defied European comprehension. Shells flowed from assembly lines like consumer goods. Transportation networks delivered them forward with clockwork reliability. Where German units counted shells by the dozen, American units counted them by the thousand. German soldiers noticed this immediately. Prisoners captured later in the Ardennes would remark, with a mixture of bitterness and disbelief, that American guns fired as if the shells grew on trees. The phrase was not metaphorical. To men raised in an economy of rationing and substitution, American abundance seemed almost unreal. The opening barrage of December 16th was not intended merely to destroy positions. It was designed to shatter assumptions. Within hours, German command posts were cut off. Telephone lines lay shredded. Units that had trained meticulously for coordinated advances found themselves isolated, deaf, and blind. Attempts to regroup were answered by fresh concentrations of fire. Movement invited destruction. stillness offered no safety. For the first time, many German officers realized that they were not fighting an enemy constrained by the same rules. The Americans did not pause to conserve strength. They did not wait for optimal conditions. They simply applied force until resistance ceased. This realization would spread rapidly in the days to come. At first, it appeared as confusion, then as unease, finally, as fear. The Ardennes offensive was conceived as a gamble, a last throw of the dice meant to fracture Allied unity and force a negotiated peace. It rested on the belief that American forces, though numerous, lacked the resilience for prolonged shock. Their soldiers were assumed to be materialistic, dependent on comfort, and psychologically brittle. German propaganda had repeated this narrative for years. American artillery destroyed that illusion in minutes. Men who had faced Soviet winter counteroffensives and British desert battles without flinching now found themselves unable to function under the weight of continuous, perfectly timed fire. It was not courage that failed them, but comprehension. They could not understand how such barrages were possible, nor how they could be sustained hour after hour. That morning in the Ardennes marked more than the opening of a battle. It marked the collapse of a worldview. For the German army, war had always been something mastered through experience and intuition. The Americans approached it as a problem solved through organization, mathematics, and production. When thousands of shells fell without warning, it was not merely the earth that shook. It was the foundation of German military confidence. The soldiers who survived that first barrage would speak of it for the rest of their lives. Some would describe it as the moment they knew the war was lost, not because of defeat in a single engagement, but because they had glimpsed a form of warfare against which courage and skill offered no answer. They had believed artillery was a weapon. What they encountered instead was an industrial process, and it had only begun. If the opening barrage in the Ardennes shattered German assumptions, the reason lay far behind the front lines, thousands of kilometers away, in places German reconnaissance officers never fully understood, and German planners fatally underestimated. American artillery did not derive its power from any single gun, shell, or tactic. It drew strength from a system, an interlocking structure of doctrine, production, logistics, and control that functioned with the reliability of an industrial process. To German officers, artillery was still fundamentally a battlefield instrument. Its effectiveness depended on terrain, visibility, ammunition availability, and the skill of individual gunners. The Americans approached it differently. To them, artillery was an extension of national industry, a means of converting factory output directly into battlefield effect. Once that logic was embraced, everything else followed. The foundation of this system was production on a scale unseen in European warfare. By 1943, American factories were manufacturing artillery ammunition at rates that defied German intelligence estimates. Facilities that had once produced automobiles, refrigerators, and agricultural machinery were converted into munitions plants almost overnight. Assembly lines were redesigned not for craftsmanship, but for volume, standardization, and speed. A single 155mm shell required precision machining, exact weight tolerances, and reliable fusing. German plants, strained by bombing, labor shortages, and material scarcity, produced shells in limited batches, each one precious. American plants treated shells as consumables. At peak output, new artillery rounds rolled off American lines every few seconds, day and night, week after week. This abundance reshaped doctrine. German artillery officers were trained to conserve ammunition, to fire only when results could be guaranteed. American doctrine encouraged the opposite. Fire was applied liberally, aggressively, and continuously. If a target might exist, it was engaged. If resistance was suspected, it was suppressed. If movement was detected, it was annihilated. The logic was simple. Steel and explosives were cheaper than lives. Behind this production stood a logistics network that made sustained fire possible. American planners understood that guns without shells were useless, and shells without transport were meaningless. From the earliest days of mobilization, the United States treated logistics as a primary weapon rather than a supporting function. Ships, railways, trucks, depots, and pipelines were planned as carefully as divisions and corps. Cargo vessels crossed the Atlantic not sporadically, but in continuous streams. Ammunition was shipped in quantities measured not in tons, but in tens of thousands of tons per convoy. Ports were expanded, railheads constructed, and entire transportation networks rebuilt in liberated territory for a single purpose: to keep artillery firing without interruption. German officers found this incomprehensible. Their own experience taught them that supply lines were fragile, easily disrupted, and chronically insufficient. They assumed the same limitations applied to their enemy. Yet American artillery units almost never faced ammunition rationing. Throughout the European campaign, there is no documented case of an American artillery unit ceasing fire because it had exhausted its stocks. This was not an accident. It was policy. Ammunition dumps were positioned forward, often dangerously close to the front. Trains ran on schedules closer to civilian freight timetables than military improvisation. Truck convoys moved continuously, regardless of weather, darkness, or enemy interference. Where German logistics relied heavily on horses and limited motor transport, the Americans depended almost entirely on trucks, thousands of them, standardized, interchangeable, and easily repaired. The effect on artillery employment was transformative. American gunners did not wait for permission to fire. They did not calculate whether shells should be saved for later phases. They fired when called, knowing that resupply would arrive before the barrels cooled. This freedom of fire produced an entirely different battlefield rhythm, one that German units could neither anticipate nor counter. Yet production and logistics alone did not explain the effectiveness of American artillery. Equally important was how that fire was controlled. German artillery doctrine emphasized decentralized execution. Batteries were often tied closely to specific infantry units. Coordination between formations required time, communication, and approval. Concentrating the fire of multiple units was possible but cumbersome. The Americans inverted this model. Control was centralized, execution decentralized. Every American division possessed a fire direction center, a nerve hub staffed not by veteran gunners alone, but by mathematically trained officers who treated firing solutions as data problems rather than battlefield improvisations. These centers maintained constant radio contact with forward observers, infantry units, and subordinate batteries. When a request for fire arrived, the center determined not which battery would respond, but how many. This distinction was critical. American artillery doctrine assumed that massed fire, precisely timed, produced effects greater than the sum of individual guns. Rather than engaging targets piecemeal, the system allowed dozens of guns to be brought onto a single point within minutes. The observer did not need to know where those guns were. He needed only to know the target's coordinates. The Germans never fully grasped this capability. Their intelligence reports often described American barrages as the work of unusually large batteries or unexpected concentrations. In reality, these fires were the result of routine procedures. What appeared exceptional to German observers was standard practice for American units. Underlying this system was an obsession with standardization. American maps used uniform grid references across theaters. Firing tables were identical regardless of location. Shell types, fuse settings, and charge increments followed strict codes understood by every artilleryman. This eliminated confusion, reduced training time, and allowed units to operate interchangeably. A forward observer trained in North Africa could be transferred to Italy or France and operate immediately without retraining. A battery redeployed from England to Normandy could fire effectively within hours of arrival. German units, by contrast, often struggled with incompatible maps, varied equipment, and region-specific procedures. Standardization extended even to personnel. American artillery officers were not selected solely for combat experience. Many came from civilian backgrounds in engineering, accounting, and mathematics. They were trained to trust tables, calculations, and procedures rather than intuition. This approach minimized individual variation and maximized predictability. To German commanders, this reliance on calculation seemed soulless and dangerous. War, in their tradition, was an art shaped by experience and judgment. The Americans treated it as a science governed by repeatable processes. Nowhere was this contrast clearer than in artillery employment. The result was speed. Targets detected by American infantry were often engaged within 2 to 3 minutes. German artillery responses, even under ideal conditions, took far longer. By the time counter-battery fire was organized, American guns had already displaced or shifted targets. This temporal advantage compounded itself. Faster fire meant fewer German survivors. Fewer survivors meant less accurate reports. Less accurate reports meant slower reactions. The system fed on its own effectiveness. German soldiers noticed this acceleration viscerally. Veterans accustomed to counting seconds between incoming rounds found no interval at all. Fire arrived fully formed, with no warning phase. Trenches that had protected men for years became death traps. Movement invited destruction. Communication collapsed under sustained bombardment. What the Germans faced was not simply heavier artillery. It was artillery unbound by traditional constraints. Ammunition was plentiful. Control was centralized. Communication was instantaneous. Calculations were pre-computed. Resupply was guaranteed. The system functioned regardless of weather, visibility, or terrain. In this environment, courage and experience lost much of their value. A veteran who knew when to dive for cover gained no advantage when all shells arrived simultaneously. A commander skilled at maneuver found no space in which to maneuver. Every solution the Germans had learned through years of war failed against a system designed to deny adaptation. By late 1944, many German officers privately acknowledged this reality. They did not blame individual units or tactical mistakes. They blamed disparity of resources and organization. The Americans, they concluded, had turned artillery into an industrial weapon, one that reflected the full weight of a continent's productive capacity. The opening barrage in the Ardennes was not an anomaly. It was the natural expression of a system that had been built, refined, and tested across 3 continents. What German soldiers experienced that morning was not improvisation, nor desperation, nor chance. It was the predictable output of an industrial process, and once unleashed, it could not be stopped. The first cracks in German confidence did not appear in the Ardennes. By December 1944, the Wehrmacht was already fighting with the uneasy awareness that something fundamental had shifted. The Ardennes barrage merely confirmed what many officers had begun to suspect months earlier. American artillery was no longer behaving like artillery at all. It was behaving like an automated system, fast, precise, and indifferent to traditional countermeasures. The earliest warning signs emerged in North Africa in late 1942. When American units first entered combat alongside the British, German veterans of the Africa Corps initially dismissed them as inexperienced. Their uniforms were clean, their movements hesitant, their officers unfamiliar with desert warfare. German intelligence reports described American formations as clumsy and doctrinally immature. Yet within days of first contact, that assessment began to unravel. German infantry positions that had comfortably endured British barrages for months suddenly ceased to exist. Observation posts were not merely suppressed, but erased. Command bunkers vanished beneath perfectly timed explosions. Telephone lines were cut so quickly that orders died in the mouths of officers attempting to issue them. What unsettled German gunners most was not the volume of fire, but its sequence. American barrages did not begin by saturating frontline trenches. Instead, they struck rear areas first: observation points, command nodes, and communication hubs. Only then did fire roll forward, collapsing the now blind frontline units. This inverted logic contradicted German expectations and nullified established defensive drills. The men on the receiving end sensed the change immediately. Veterans who prided themselves on surviving shelling by instinct found that instinct useless. There was no safe interval, no adjustment phase. The first indication of incoming fire was the impact itself. By the time fighting moved into Italy in 1943, these anomalies had become patterns. German reports from Sicily and the mainland increasingly referenced instantaneous concentration fires and simultaneous mass impact. Officers noted that American shells often landed together despite originating from different batteries at varying distances. This phenomenon acquired a name: time on target. The concept was deceptively simple. Instead of firing simultaneously, each battery calculated its firing time so that all shells, regardless of range, arrived at the target at the exact same second. Longer-range guns fired earlier, shorter-range guns fired later. The result was a single moment of total destruction. German artillery doctrine offered no equivalent. Ranging shots were essential to German practice. Fire was adjusted gradually, corrections issued after observation. This process created warning, audible cues that allowed experienced soldiers to seek cover. Time on target eliminated that warning entirely. To German infantrymen, it felt as if the sky itself had detonated. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Soldiers accustomed to diving for cover at the first whistle found themselves buried before they could move. Trenches collapsed. Dugouts caved in. Even those who survived the initial impacts emerged disoriented, shaken, and often incapable of coordinated action. German officers attempted to adapt. Orders emphasized dispersion, deeper fortifications, and rapid movement after detection. But these measures assumed time to react, time to relocate, time to communicate. American artillery denied all three. The deeper issue lay in information flow. German artillery units relied heavily on visual observation and wired communication. Once those lines were severed, batteries operated blindly. American units, by contrast, used radio as their primary means of coordination. Forward observers did not need to see their guns. They needed only to transmit coordinates. This difference proved decisive. An American observer with a radio could summon fire from dozens of guns beyond the horizon. A German observer cut off from telephone lines could do nothing at all. Attempts to use runners or flares were futile under sustained bombardment. By early 1944, German intelligence recognized that American artillery response times were collapsing traditional cycles of action and reaction. Reports noted that American fire often followed detection of German movement within minutes, sometimes seconds. Counter-battery fire, once a reliable method of suppressing enemy guns, became increasingly ineffective. Guns that fired once were destroyed before firing again. This was not coincidence. American units increasingly employed sound ranging, flash spotting, and early radar techniques to locate enemy batteries. Once detected, those positions were rapidly neutralized by massed fire. German gunners learned that survival depended on mobility, but mobility required fuel and vehicles increasingly in short supply. The cumulative effect was a sense of helplessness. German soldiers found themselves under constant threat without the means to retaliate. The battlefield became asymmetric not in numbers, but in responsiveness. Italian terrain, with its narrow valleys and ridgelines, magnified this imbalance. German positions that once dominated approaches were rendered untenable by precise, concentrated fire. Entire companies were destroyed without ever seeing an American infantryman. By the summer of 1944, during the fighting in Normandy, the fractures had widened into open realization. German units defending the bocage initially believed the hedgerows would negate Allied advantages. Tanks and aircraft were restricted. Infantry would decide the fight. Artillery shattered that belief. American forward observers embedded with infantry exploited every gap and movement. A German squad repositioning behind a hedgerow could trigger a fire mission that obliterated the entire area. Attempts to reinforce threatened sectors were met with preemptive barrages that annihilated columns before they reached the line. German after-action reports from Normandy repeatedly referenced impossible fire coordination. Officers noted that American guns seemed to anticipate movement, striking routes moments after units began to advance. This created a pervasive sense of exposure, as if the enemy could see through terrain itself. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. American artillery did not need to see individual soldiers. It needed only patterns, roads, assembly areas, likely routes of movement. Once identified, those patterns were punished relentlessly. By the time German forces withdrew toward the Seine, many officers privately conceded that artillery dominance had become decisive. Tanks could be ambushed. Aircraft could be evaded. Infantry could dig in. But artillery, American artillery, was everywhere, and it was always faster. This realization reached its most dangerous stage in late 1944. German planners launching the Ardennes offensive assumed surprise and weather would compensate for Allied advantages. They expected to face limited artillery fire during the initial phase. What they encountered instead was the culmination of 2 years of refinement. The first fractures had become a fault line, and under pressure, it would collapse entirely. By the summer of 1944, the cumulative weight of American artillery had begun to crush German operational cohesion. What had started as isolated shocks in North Africa and Italy now became systemic collapse in Western Europe. The Normandy campaign marked the moment when German commanders could no longer pretend they were facing a familiar enemy. Artillery was no longer a preparatory arm. It had become the decisive force. The German defense of Normandy relied on terrain. The bocage, dense hedgerows, sunken lanes, and narrow fields, was expected to neutralize Allied advantages in armor and air power. German infantry had learned to fight defensively in such environments, channeling attackers into kill zones and counterattacking with precision. On paper, it was ideal ground for a veteran army. American artillery made that logic obsolete. Fire did not need clear lines of sight. It did not need massed formations to target. It required only coordinates and probability. Hedgerows that concealed machine gun nests one moment were obliterated the next. Assembly areas vanished before attacks could form. German counterattacks were shattered before they crossed their own start lines. The collapse became undeniable during the breakout from Normandy. In late July, American commanders prepared a concentrated offensive, designed not merely to penetrate German lines, but to annihilate them. The artillery preparation that preceded the attack was unprecedented in precision and density. Hundreds of guns, ranging from light field howitzers to the heaviest pieces available, were assigned specific targets within a narrow frontage. This was not saturation fire in the traditional sense. It was calculated destruction. Each battery had a designated sector. Each gun had pre-assigned coordinates. Fire plans were rehearsed down to the minute. There would be no random bombardment, no wasted shells. Every round had a purpose. When the guns opened fire, German defenses disintegrated almost instantly. Units that had survived weeks of air attacks and localized shelling were erased in less than an hour. Entire regiments ceased to function as organized formations. Survivors wandered in shock, deafened and disoriented, incapable of resistance. German armored units suffered particularly devastating losses. Tanks that never saw an enemy vehicle were disabled, overturned, or abandoned by crews stunned into flight. Artillery fire severed command links, destroyed fuel trucks, and collapsed maintenance areas. The German ability to respond coherently simply vanished. This was not a battle of maneuver. It was an industrial execution. German commanders later described the experience with a striking uniformity of language. They spoke of being ground down, pulverized, crushed. These were not metaphors chosen lightly. They reflected a reality in which the battlefield itself seemed to turn hostile. Attempts to regroup were punished immediately. American observers detected movement and called fire within minutes. The very act of assembling units for counterattack became impossible. German doctrine, which relied on flexible response and local initiative, found no space in which to operate. As the front collapsed, the German army retreated eastward under constant pressure. Cities once designated as fortresses were reduced systematically. Streets, intersections, and strong points were methodically destroyed by artillery before infantry entered. Urban warfare, traditionally costly and prolonged, became a process of attrition weighted overwhelmingly in the attacker's favor. German units defending these cities reported a new and terrifying phenomenon: fire without pause. Barrages did not come in waves. They did not stop at night. They did not ease to allow recovery. Artillery followed infantry advances step by step, crushing resistance seconds before assault troops arrived. This technique, the rolling barrage, was not new in concept, but American execution refined it to a lethal degree. Fire lifted only when friendly troops were within meters of the impact zone. Positions were seized before defenders could recover from shock. Resistance, when it occurred at all, was fragmented and brief. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers accustomed to rigid defensive timelines found themselves unable to anticipate the next moment of survival. There was no rhythm to exploit, no lull to regroup. The mind broke before the body. Heavy artillery amplified this effect. American long-range guns reached targets previously considered safe. Command posts relocated repeatedly, only to be rediscovered and destroyed. Officers learned that rank and experience offered no protection. Artillery did not discriminate. The introduction of rocket artillery added another layer of terror. The distinctive sound of massed rockets, audible kilometers away, shattered morale even when physical damage was limited. German troops described the noise as unbearable, an assault on the senses that robbed them of the will to remain in position. Units facing these weapons often collapsed without direct engagement. Soldiers abandoned weapons, fled positions, or surrendered at the first opportunity. Discipline eroded rapidly under the strain of constant bombardment. By early autumn 1944, German reports acknowledged the strategic implications. Artillery supremacy had allowed American forces to advance faster, sustain momentum, and absorb fewer casualties than anticipated. Defensive depth became meaningless when every layer could be destroyed in sequence. Attempts to conserve manpower by withdrawing early merely ceded ground faster. Holding firm invited annihilation. There was no correct choice. Nowhere was this imbalance clearer than in the fighting for fortified cities along the German frontier. Defenses that had taken months to construct were erased in days. Concrete bunkers cracked open, reinforced positions collapsed. The promise of prolonged resistance proved illusory. German commanders faced an impossible equation. They could not match American rates of fire. They could not replace destroyed guns. They could not protect their communications. Even when local successes were achieved, they were fleeting and unsustainable. The collapse under pressure was not sudden. It was cumulative and inexorable. Each engagement stripped away another assumption, another tactic, another hope of stabilization. Artillery dominance transformed every German weakness into a fatal vulnerability. By the time winter returned to the Western Front, the German army was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to endure, and endurance against this system was no longer possible. By the winter of 1944, recognition spread through the German command structure with grim clarity. The problem was no longer tactical misjudgment or local inferiority. It was systemic. American artillery had become a force against which adaptation itself was futile. German officers understood this not through theory, but through repeated failure. Every attempted adjustment produced the same result. Dispersion, long a defensive reflex against artillery, offered little protection when fire arrived simultaneously across entire grid squares. Deeper dugouts collapsed under concentrated impacts. Night movement, once a reliable method of avoiding detection, lost effectiveness as American fire plans increasingly relied on probability rather than observation. Even camouflage failed because American gunners did not need to see targets to destroy them. German doctrine emphasized initiative at the lower levels, junior officers making rapid decisions based on local conditions. This philosophy had served them well earlier in the war. Under American artillery dominance, it became irrelevant. No initiative could function when communication lines were severed within minutes, and entire command groups were erased without warning. The German response became increasingly reactive. Units learned to move only in small packets, to halt frequently, to dig constantly. But this slowed maneuver to a crawl. Operational tempo, the very thing German doctrine prized, collapsed. American forces, by contrast, accelerated. The imbalance reached its most dramatic expression during the Ardennes counteroffensive. German planners had chosen December precisely because poor weather would neutralize Allied aircraft. For the first days, this assumption held. Fog grounded planes. Snow obscured movement. German columns advanced farther than expected. Then the skies cleared. What followed confirmed every fear German officers had suppressed. American artillery surged to full effectiveness, now complemented by unrestricted air power. Fire missions multiplied. Ammunition expenditure soared. Targets that had survived the initial assault vanished in hours. General commanders attempting to coordinate countermeasures found themselves overwhelmed by volume and speed. Requests for artillery support went unanswered, not because guns were unavailable, but because ammunition was rationed to a trickle. German batteries often had fewer than 20 rounds per gun per day. American batteries fired hundreds without hesitation. The contrast was not lost on German soldiers. Prisoners captured during the fighting remarked with bitter irony that American gunners fired as if they were practicing. To men trained to conserve every round, this apparent indifference to expenditure was demoralizing beyond measure. Recognition deepened into resignation. German officers began to speak openly of industrial disparity. They acknowledged that the United States possessed a productive capacity Germany could neither match nor disrupt. Bombing campaigns against American industry were impossible. Submarine warfare had failed to sever supply lines. Every destroyed American gun was replaced quickly, often before its absence was even noticed. Attempts at adaptation shifted from tactical to psychological. German units tried to endure bombardment rather than counter it. Orders emphasized morale, discipline, and cohesion under fire. Chaplains and medical officers reported rising cases of combat exhaustion, tremors, insomnia, and panic reactions triggered by shelling. The term artillery shock entered German medical vocabulary. American commanders, observing these effects, adjusted accordingly. Harassment fire increased. Short, irregular barrages struck at unpredictable intervals, denying rest and eroding resilience. The purpose was not destruction, but attrition of will. German units subjected to such treatment often became combat ineffective without direct assault. Night barrages proved especially devastating. Shells detonated above trenches, scattering fragments downward and eliminating cover. Flares and illumination rounds exposed movement. Rocket fire added noise and terror. Soldiers reported hallucinations, breakdowns, and uncontrollable fear. German intelligence reports from late 1944 increasingly emphasized psychological collapse rather than physical losses. Entire companies were rendered ineffective without suffering catastrophic casualties. Men abandoned positions at the sound of incoming fire. Surrenders increased, often en masse. Senior commanders could not ignore these trends. Post-war memoirs reveal the moment of collective realization. The war was no longer lost because of inferior tactics or leadership. It was lost because Germany could not compete with an enemy who treated war as a problem of organization and output. Field officers admitted privately that resistance served only to delay the inevitable at the cost of lives they could no longer justify expending. The concept of decisive battle, a cornerstone of German military thought, had been rendered obsolete by continuous, overwhelming firepower. By early 1945, adaptation gave way to endurance. German forces fought on not an expectation of victory, but out of obligation, fear, or habit. The initiative belonged entirely to the Allies. Artillery dictated where and when fighting occurred. The final proof came during the Allied crossings of major rivers. German commanders massed guns in anticipation of repelling assaults. American counter-battery fire destroyed the majority of those guns before they fired a single effective salvo. Radar-directed artillery, rapid response, and sheer volume combined to erase German preparations almost instantly. Reports from the period read less like battle narratives and more like inventories of loss. Recognition, when it came, was complete. American artillery had not merely outperformed its German counterpart. It had rendered the German system obsolete, and there was no adaptation left to attempt. By the spring of 1945, the outcome of the war in Western Europe was no longer in doubt. The German army continued to fight, but it did so within a shrinking space defined entirely by Allied firepower. At the center of that firepower stood American artillery, not as a supporting arm, but as the dominant force shaping every operational and strategic decision. The final months of the war revealed the full consequences of this transformation. As Allied armies advanced toward the Rhine, German commanders attempted one last time to impose structure on the chaos. Defensive lines were planned in depth, rivers were prepared as natural barriers. Artillery concentrations were assembled to shatter crossings before they could be established. On paper, the plan was sound. In practice, it collapsed within hours. American counter-battery fire, guided by radar, sound ranging, and rapid communication, destroyed German guns before they could exert meaningful influence. Batteries that survived their first salvo were located and silenced almost immediately. The traditional duel between artillery forces, once a defining feature of European warfare, ceased to exist. The contest was no longer between gunners. It was between systems, and only one system functioned. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, German defenders faced the same pattern repeated on a grand scale. Preparations detected, guns destroyed, positions crushed, infantry overwhelmed, resistance dissolved. Entire defensive concepts that had once required months of planning were erased in minutes by concentrated fire. The psychological weight of this dominance was as decisive as its physical effects. German soldiers entering combat in 1945 no longer believed they could influence outcomes through skill or bravery. They fought knowing that survival depended less on their actions than on whether they happened to be inside or outside an artillery grid at a given moment. This sense of inevitability accelerated collapse. Units surrendered at unprecedented rates. Desertion increased. Commanders reported an inability to motivate troops once artillery fire began. The sound of incoming shells became a signal not to resist, but to endure or flee. American commanders understood this effect and exploited it deliberately. Artillery was used not merely to destroy, but to dislocate, demoralize, and paralyze. Fire plans were designed to deny sleep, disrupt movement, and fragment command structures. Infantry advances often encountered defenders already broken by bombardment. By April, organized German resistance west of the Elbe was largely finished. What remained were isolated pockets, often commanded by officers who understood the futility of continued fighting, but lacked authority or courage to surrender. These positions were eliminated with methodical precision. In the final weeks, American heavy artillery joined the last great battles of the European War from a distance. Long-range guns struck targets far beyond the immediate front, contributing to the collapse of remaining German defenses. When Allied forces met along the Elbe, American artillery thundered in the background, not as a tool of desperation, but as a symbol of completed dominance. The war in Europe ended not with a climactic clash of armies, but with a gradual suffocation under overwhelming firepower. The statistics tell part of the story. American artillery fired billions of rounds during the European campaign. It accounted for the majority of German casualties on the Western Front. It enabled advances at speeds previously considered impossible. It reduced Allied losses by destroying resistance before infantry and armor were exposed. But numbers alone cannot explain its true significance. American artillery reshaped the logic of modern warfare. It demonstrated that victory no longer belonged to the army with the most experienced soldiers or the boldest commanders. It belonged to the force that could organize, supply, and coordinate violence at industrial scale. German military thinkers recognized this too late. In post-war reflections, many acknowledged that they had misjudged the nature of the conflict. They had prepared for a war of maneuver, decision, and operational brilliance. They encountered a war of production, calculation, and sustained application of force. The difference proved fatal. The lessons of this transformation did not end in 1945. The principles developed by American artillery, centralized fire control, rapid response, standardized procedures, and overwhelming logistical support, became the foundation of modern military doctrine. Later technologies would refine them, but not replace them. Precision-guided munitions, satellite navigation, computerized targeting, all trace their lineage to systems created during the Second World War. The underlying philosophy remains unchanged. Speed, accuracy, mass, and coordination determine outcomes. Modern conflicts continue to confirm this reality. Wherever artillery dominates, maneuver follows. Wherever logistics sustain firepower, resistance collapses. The battlefield has become less a test of individual heroism and more a contest of organizational capacity. In this sense, American artillery did more than help win the Second World War. It marked the transition from war as an art to war as a science. The soldiers who experienced its effects did not think in such terms. To them, it was noise, terror, and destruction without pause. For historians, it represents a turning point, one where industrial logic eclipsed martial tradition. The young German machine gunner in the Ardennes never understood what struck him. He died believing he was facing another barrage, another survivable storm of steel. He could not know that he stood at the threshold of a new era, one in which firepower was no longer constrained by human limits. The 4,752 shells that fell in 4 minutes were not just weapons. They were data points, outputs, proof of concept. They announced the arrival of a system that would define warfare for generations. The sky had become a weapon, and it would never relinquish that role again.